you will be forgiven if you find it humorous when I say that I intend for this to be a short video. Things happen. What this video wants to look at is 3 different parts of role-playing games: the roll to hit, the roll for damage, and skill use, and the framing and interpretation of these roles. So returning to the concept of framing, but providing a focus more on the language used when doing it. As we go through these examples, maybe some things will become more obvious than they might be in a conversation on a forum or an exchange in comments. Language will really be the part that we focus on most in this clip. And to begin, let's look at a phrase that you might hear when you're investigating or looking at certain types of games. Some of them old and some of them not so old. And the phrase attached to these games is rolling to fail. Now, where this phrase comes from, if you haven't heard it, is really the idea that the player character will be asked to, let's say, roll to hit, and the target is then given a roll to defend themselves, to parry, which then, if successful, ends the encounter. So I rolled to hit. If I fail, I fail. If I'm successful, I might still fail. If the other guy fails and I'm successful, then we move on to the next step. So you might note that there's 2 chances to fail here and 1 chance for success. And then, if I'm successful, if he doesn't defend, then we move to the damage phase, and you can guess what's coming next. I have to roll a variable amount of damage, meaning I might get something very, very small, and there are defensive measures at the other end of this roll. So I might produce very little damage, and some kind of defensive ability may wipe out whatever damage I did anyway. So there are many more opportunities to not succeed, or at least not produce a meaningful effect in this exchange, than there are to produce a meaningful effect. And this, especially in a protracted scene or in the sort of campaign where that activity is, right out in front, the overall experience for the player may be vastly different than the experience for the game master. The game master is not attached to the perspective of any one character, and they're seeing perhaps they're imagining the emerging story in their heads as more of an ebb and flow of success and failure. But for the player sitting there, the ebb and flow seems to be caught in this tide pool of failures with these high points of success. And it's not saying that these games are bad, but it's saying that these games run the risk of being mishandled. It's not the mechanics in and of themselves which are bad. Like any tool, it's how they get used. And from my point of view, it's often the language surrounding how they are used which leads to the less than satisfactory effects. At its base level, we can strip everything out of a combat exchange and wind up with just this: the game master saying roll to hit, receiving the resulting number from that roll, and then, if successful, saying roll for damage. That could be the extent of your combat experience in any scene. It would be pretty quick, and imagination would be entirely left up to the individual players in that scene. Not a lot of description flowing back and forth, not a lot of engagement, not a lot of characterization. It may still be a very fun game, but think of it as each person's fun is isolated and resting almost entirely in their hands. As we add in more and more detail on top of that basic framework, we produce some of the more, let's say, exciting, some of the more interesting elements which players begin to notice, to interact with, to identify with, to want to build more on, that kind of stuff. With detail comes more story elements. The imagination becomes filled in with the inclusion of other people's imaginative process. This is nice. But combat rolls around again, and we're faced with, how is this actually framed? How is the task of engaging in combat handled? Is this process focused on what the player is doing? Roll to hit. Is the process focused on what the character is doing? Right? Where we expect the player to tell us the action that the character is undertaking. Is it based on the perception of the character, where we expect the game master to narrate what the character just did? We have three different possibilities in this example. What the player is doing, roll to hit. Ah, you got a 20. You hit. What the player imagines is happening, right? What are you going to do? Oh, I step in and I feint to the left and then cut. Or what the game master imagines is happening. Right? You step up, right? Take a blow on your shield and hit. Each of these leads to a different imagined environment. Two of these can benefit from more description, either coming from the player or flowing from the game master. The one focused on the player, that doesn't really seem to be appropriate, does it? And flipping back and forth from moments of description to moments of no description at all, this, I guess, could represent a fourth example, which we're not going to delve into too deeply. So, framing that hit roll. What is actually being described? Right? That's what framing is about. What am I rolling to accomplish? There needs to be something to accomplish. Is it like RuneQuest 6? Is one roll in combat, one action in combat, one cut of the sword, one block with a shield? Right? Is that what it represents in the system that you're using? Or is it more like another popular game where things are abstracted over a period of time, and that one roll is representative of all the combat actions which are taking place within that period of time? Is it something that needs to be narrated by the player or by the game master, blow by blow, or let's say exchange by exchange, scene by scene? Is there jockeying for position going on? Are there feints and cuts and thrusts and blocks and redirects and several damaging wounds, all of which total up to one roll, one damage roll, and one narration? Or is every single action defined? Knowing that about your system is the first step in framing the roll. Disharmony in understanding this makes for dissatisfaction at the table. If one person, let's say the player, is imagining that this roll represents one cut, and the game master is imagining it being an exchange of cuts and thrusts and presses and changing of range, and right, their experience of this is going to be very, very different. The player rolls for their one cut and misses, and they can't even imagine really how they could fail to hit this target that's standing right in front of them. Whereas the game master is imagining this exchange of fighting going on with little nicks and cuts and hits and redirects and everywhere, which at the end of the scene may have culminated in one side having the upper hand. Both end up in failure for the player. One is a failed action. The other is losing the upper hand. when everybody's on the same page in terms of the level of abstraction or detail in the system, and they understand how the roles are being framed so that they are connecting with the description with the right understanding, with the right comprehension, then we move on to the actual description. If the player is narrating the actions that their character is taking, they of course need to know how far they can go in the narration. But the key point is, this is their opportunity to express how their character appears in their own imagination, to share it with the table. If this description is performed by the game master, saying, okay, you hit, so your character steps in and, right, then we are experiencing the game master's imagination of each of the characters around the table. Again, I'm not placing value on any of these approaches. These are just approaches, and they have specific effects. Player narration brings out the different imaginations from around the table and puts them into a shared space where each imagination feeds on and informs the others. It has a certain amount of difficulty to balance the flow. Not everyone has the same appreciation of genre and style, so some people might be introducing elements that you prefer weren't there. And so in a unified vision where the game master is presenting all of the description from the results, you do get one, let's say, style of narration coming back. Even with mismatched inputs, the game master synthesizes those into something that is representative of the whole that they're trying to produce. Right? A group that works well together, that meshes well together, that understands genre together, right, doesn't introduce that problem, and so may have a very easy time with shared narration. Right. That's really why we end up saying it depends on your group. Why we end up saying talk to your players. Right? Establish this level of communication so that you can actually make an informed choice and ensure greater comprehension and understanding around the table of what's going on. So we understand the level of abstraction at the table. If one role represents one action, or if it represents a series of actions and an ebb and flow to combat. Then we nail down who is responsible for narrating what things look like when they happen. So let's look at two examples. One from a system where there's simply a roll to hit, which is successful or not, and it factors in the opponent's defensive actions into that one roll. And let's look at a system where there's an interplay of attack and defense. Let's say we have one to hit roll, which encompasses everything about that exchange. Let's say that it's a duel. Two characters are fighting with swords. The player character and a non-player character. And the player character decides to thrust, and they describe, or the game master describes, this thrust. So everybody's clear on how the roll is being framed. A successful hit on this single roll will mean an opportunity to do damage from the thrust. Simple. Okay, player rolls and misses. Now we're in the interpretation phase. What has been denied is the opportunity to do damage. What might be implied by failing is an out-and-out miss. Right? But there's more to this single roll than just that. Right? All that has been determined is I have no opportunity as the player to do damage. Right? So I extend into my thrust. There are myriad things which the opponent can do at this point, which are reflected in my roll to hit, which run the risk of never being expressed. Just you miss, you miss, you miss. Now imagine, take yourself out and you're floating above the player as a disembodied observer, and you hear this all night long. You miss, you miss, you miss. Ah, you hit, roll your damage. Ah, great, 1 damage. Okay, we've all been there, I think. It didn't really need to be narrated that way. It doesn't need to be narrated that way. That roll to hit gets tied up in the language of that phrase, that label, to hit. All right? To hit and do damage being what it meant. And what its actual narrative impact is, it's the threshold. On one side of that threshold, you are not allowed to inflict damage. On the other side, you are. So, in this narrative, that failed thrust could have been beaten aside by the dancing skill of the enemy, describing how the enemy takes this very good thrust offline, right, can be used to fuel the passion of the player, right? Create that level of tension and fear, right, that combat could bring, right? Could raise their ire, could get them really angry and enjoying that opportunity to roll dice with you and see who's going to come out on top, right? It doesn't have to be you miss, right? You go wide, you fall short, you trip, things like these. This doesn't have to happen. It can happen, right? It's one of many possible things that can happen. Let's shift over to the other example where every action is accounted for. So again, same situation. The player character rolls for a thrust and they miss. In a system like RuneQuest 6, the defending player now gets a tactical choice. Right? They can conserve their ability to act in this round, not use a parry on that blow, right? Instead, we can imagine a change of distance, right? We can imagine a sidestep. We can imagine them using an attack action to interrupt or deal with this blow rather than a discrete defensive maneuver, right? So yes, the attack failed. This thrust wasn't good enough, meaning they could convert it to their own advantage and attack through it, attack around it, right? Whereas a successful thrust, they must answer with some sort of defensive action. They must dedicate an attack to taking that offline before they can reply. Right? So the interplay here is exactly the same as the other, right? Dealing with what the opponent does compared to what the player has done builds the scene. Not relying on language like you didn't hit, you missed, you failed. Taking that out and leaving it as purely descriptive, right? The sword extends, right? What does the enemy do in response to that? We know the character has not enabled themselves to do damage. So, what comes next? This is the interplay of framing and interpreting roles to build the scene. And it's not about putting a spotlight on the character. It's not about making some interaction cooler than it was. It's about bringing the world to life. How the character feels about themselves, how the player feels about their character. These are things that can be brought into more focus, sharper focus, when we as the narrators bring out those details. Rather than judging the details, you failed, you missed, right? You hit, but describing the details, more of the world comes to life. This has spillover effects. Let's move on and talk about this in terms of skills. In skill use, the exact same principles apply. Framing the role so that everybody at the table understands what a success translates into, what it gives them an opportunity to do next, what a failure constitutes, what they are not now able to do. Both of these things open up more areas of description. Right? So, breaking into a building, right? In a very abstracted system, like with a one roll to break into the building. This could represent using a brick to smash through a window, or it could represent days of studying the flow of security, figuring out how the locks work, and getting your way inside, right? The more abstract it becomes, the more the character is lost when not described. All the little things that they know how to do. Right? If we're not very comfortable with that field, whatever it might be, then these abstracted roles are great because it allows us to bypass all those details that we're just going to trip ourselves up on. But at the same time, you fail can have a devastating effect on momentum, especially when it's like, well, you need to break into the building, but you fail. 2 days later, you know, so I fail. I've got nothing to go on. I've got no mental traction for imagination. We need to at least establish some of the actions taken, right? And hint at what happened on the other end to bring about this failure, right? I'm a skilled professional. I have this skill. Now, I didn't happen to succeed at this moment, but even monkeys fall out of trees. The thing is, I need to know why I wasn't successful. The key point here is that the failed roll does not have to mean that the character has in some way screwed up. It's free to mean that. It can mean that. It can be very interesting if it means that. But it doesn't have to mean that, and it certainly doesn't have to mean that all the time. The opponents or the obstacles or the challenges faced can also be competent. They can also have done something which prevented success, which doesn't mean that you, as the character, aren't any good. It means that you need to try a little harder. In a game like Ubiquity, a rising degree of challenge will eventually encourage the player to contribute style points, exerting the character, bringing more and more of their unique heroic quality to bear on the problem. Right? We can see this in other games as well. In games without that mechanic, all you have is the language that you're using. Right? It's a different style of play. And the more stripped down the language becomes, the fewer opportunities for action that are provided. A greater opportunity for misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and two people sitting at the same table having such a completely different experience that one has a pretty good time and a pretty positive feeling about it, and the other feels like they just spent 4 hours failing. Eventually, one of these people is going to leave the game. To be clear, I'm not advocating for heavy description all the time. What I am advocating for is taking the time to assess how you frame roles, how you set them up. Do you have a clear endpoint for that role? Does everybody at the table recognize what that endpoint is? Do they know how abstract or how granular your particular system is, or the way you're going to be approaching this particular role? Does this role mean 6 seconds? Does this role mean today? Does this role represent a week of research? Do the players know this? Is everybody imagining the same level of abstraction in the system? Same endpoint, same level of abstraction. And then, when it comes time to interpret the role, are you considering more than pass-fail? Right? Are you allowing your brain to step away from the label to hit? Right? The label succeed, fail, and describe how the elements in the scene are interacting with each other. That's what I'm suggesting. How has this been working out in your games? Let's talk about it.